The drilling rig groaned in the Martian wind. Arthur Voss wiped hydraulic fluid from his forearms and squinted at the pressure gauge. 340 psi, holding steady. Around him, the Hellas Basin stretched in every direction like a rusted wound in the planet's surface, a depression so vast it had its own microclimate, its own morning fog that crept low across the ochre ground before burning away in the thin dawn. He had been on Mars for 11 months. He had stopped finding it beautiful around month 3. He was, by trade and temperament, a mechanic. Not the romantic kind, not the sort who named their tools or whispered to engines the way some old-timers did back in the oil fields of Alberta. Arthur fixed things because things broke, and because someone had to, and because he was very good at it. He had grown up taking apart his mother's washing machine and putting it back together before she got home from her shift at the hospital. He had done the same with motorcycles, industrial generators, CNC lathes, and eventually, through a sequence of improbable events involving a bar bet and a NASA contractor in Houston, the atmospheric processors and drilling mechanisms of humanity's first semi-permanent research outpost on the surface of Mars. The outpost was called Hellas Station, though the 8 people who lived there called it the Pit, not affectionately. The Pit had a gym that smelled of recycled air and old sweat. It had a common room where someone had taped a photograph of the Pacific Ocean to the wall above the coffee dispenser. Arthur had never asked whose it was, but he'd noticed that no one ever took it down. It had a medical bay that Dr. Chowdhury ran with the organized terror of a field surgeon, and a comms room that crackled with a 20-minute delay between every word spoken and every word heard, a constant reminder that they were, in every meaningful sense, alone. Arthur liked the rig best. Out here in his suit the problems were honest. Pressure was either right or it wasn't. A seal held or it failed. There was no ambiguity in metal. His comm crackled. Voss, the voice was Dr. Cassidy Ray's. Calm, flat, with the particular quality of a person who had decided in advance that whatever she was about to say would be stated without drama. You're going to want to see this. Arthur didn't move immediately. In his 11 months on Mars, he had learned that things people wanted you to see were rarely simple and never good. He pressed the gauge one more time, still 340, still holding, and then he unclipped his tether from the rig's safety rail. "On my way," he said. Cassidy was at the main terminal when he arrived at the command module, her back to the door, both hands moving across the haptic display with the focused efficiency that Arthur had come to recognize as her version of urgency. She was a geophysicist by training, Mars Geological Survey, subsurface mapping, atmospheric chemistry on the side. On a skeleton crew of 8, however, everyone was also everything else. Cassidy was the closest thing they had to a geologist, a seismologist, and when Dr. Chowdhury was asleep, a first responder. She had a stillness about her that Arthur respected. Not calm, exactly. Something more deliberate, the quality of a person who had audited her own emotional responses and determined, with scientific rigor, that panic was an inefficiency she could not afford. She did not look up when he entered. "It's not a lava tube," she said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." He looked at the display. The ground-penetrating radar had mapped a cavity 40 meters below the bore point, a perfectly spherical void, 12 meters in diameter, set into solid Martian regolith that had no business being hollow. Natural formations didn't make spheres. Nature was not interested in geometry. "Wall composition?" he asked. "Approximately 94% silicon carbide," she said, "arranged in a crystalline lattice structure that does not occur naturally in this solar system, or any solar system I'm aware of." Arthur sat down slowly, the kind of sitting down that happens when your legs make a decision before your brain does. "You're saying someone built it." "I'm saying the data says someone built it." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark and very steady. I haven't said anything to Houston yet. He understood immediately. The moment you transmitted a thing like this, across the 20-minute signal delay, into the ears of agencies and governments and committees and press offices, it stopped belonging to you. It stopped belonging to anyone at Hellas Station. It became a thing that existed in conference rooms, in secure channels, in the careful language of people who managed information for a living. How long before the automated diagnostic reports flag the anomaly to mission control? 6 hours, maybe 8 if I adjust the flagging threshold. She paused. I'm not suggesting we falsify data. I know you're not. I'm suggesting we use the time we have. They looked at each other across the terminal. Outside, the wind moved across the basin in long, slow waves, and the rig continued its patient work, and somewhere 40 meters below them, a sphere of silicon carbide waited with the patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time. We go down, Arthur said. Cassidy nodded once, the way she nodded when a calculation had already been completed and a decision had already been made. We go down, she agreed. They told no one. This was, Arthur knew, technically a violation of Hellas Station protocol. All surface operations required 2 support staff on standby. All anomalous readings required immediate team briefing. All modifications to the bore plan required mission control sign-off, which, given the 20-minute signal delay each way, meant a minimum 40-minute wait per exchange, assuming someone was monitoring the channel, which at 3:40 hours local time was not guaranteed. They suited up in the equipment bay in near silence. Cassidy ran a full diagnostic on both suits without being asked. Arthur checked the tether systems twice, and the emergency oxygen reserves 3 times. These were not the actions of reckless people. They were the actions of careful people who had decided that carefulness and caution were not the same thing. The descent took 4 hours. Manual bore expansion was surgical work, slow, precise, each meter of new shaft requiring evaluation before the next meter was attempted. Arthur ran the drill. Cassidy ran the sensors. They communicated in the clipped, functional language of people who had worked together long enough to have edited out the unnecessary words. Stability. Good, wall integrity 97%. Keep going. Depth. 31 meters, 9 to go. At 36 meters, the drill resistance changed. Not dramatically, not the lurch of breakthrough that Arthur had expected, but a subtle shift in the torque reading, a slight change in the acoustic signature of the bit against rock. He throttled back immediately. You feel that? He asked. I saw it, we're close. At 39.7 meters, the bit stopped. Not because it had broken through, not because the rock had hardened. It stopped because the material ahead of it was no longer rock. The torque readings flatlined. The acoustic sensors registered a frequency that Cassidy had never encountered in 4 years of geophysical fieldwork. The GPR image sharpened as they closed distance, and what it showed was a wall of such geometric perfection. Every atom of silicon carbide arranged with a regularity that made conventional crystal structures look chaotic by comparison, that Cassidy found herself holding her breath without knowing why. Arthur, she said quietly, the wall, it's reacting to the drill contact. Reacting how? Molecular reorganization. The surface layer is redistributing, not breaking, redistributing. He pulled the drill back. They both watched the sensor feed. A section of the wall, roughly door-shaped, though calling it a door felt like an act of dangerous anthropomorphism, had begun to draw inward, smoothly, silently, the way a pupil contracts in response to light, not broken, not forced, not reacting to them in any way that implied threat or welcome, simply adjusting. The sphere had noticed them. The sphere had opened. Arthur's hands, he noticed distantly, were not shaking. This surprised him. What he felt was not fear, or not only fear. It was something older and stranger, a feeling he had last had as a boy of 7 standing at the edge of his grandfather's forest in Manitoba at dusk, knowing with absolute certainty that something was watching from between the trees, and being entirely unable to decide whether to run or walk forward. He had walked forward then. He moved the drill rig aside and widened the access shaft manually, careful and unhurried. Cassidy was already preparing the sensor package, radiation counter, atmospheric analyzer, spectrometer, thermal imager. She worked with the methodical precision of someone who had understood, in the last 4 hours, that they were about to do something that every protocol in the history of human spaceflight had failed to anticipate, and that the only appropriate response to that was to be as rigorous as possible. "Atmospheric composition inside?" he asked. "Processing." A pause. "Argon, helium, trace xenon. No nitrogen, no oxygen. Pressure is..." She checked the reading twice. 0.4 atmospheres. Lethal to human tissue without suit protection. Temperature? -60 Celsius. Uniform throughout the interior. "Nothing about this was built for us," Arthur said. "No," Cassidy agreed. "Nothing about this was built for us." They descended on tethers through the expanded bore shaft, their helmet lights cutting through the Martian dark, until Arthur's boots found the floor of the sphere, and he stood, for the first time in human history, inside something that had not been built by human hands. The interior was not dark. A faint luminescence pulsed along the curved walls, slow, irregular, and deeply, profoundly wrong in a way that Arthur could feel before his instruments could measure it. His spectrometer registered wavelengths that his display had no color names for, frequencies that fell into gaps between the colors his eyes were built to see. He found himself staring at the walls and experiencing the uncomfortable sensation of almost understanding something. The way you sometimes almost grasp a word in a language you've been studying, meaning hovering at the edge of comprehension, just beyond reach. The sphere was approximately 12 meters in diameter. The floor was flat, which was the only concession to any geometry that Arthur recognized as practical. The walls curved up and over in a seamless arc. There were no seams anywhere, no joints, no fasteners, no indication of how the sphere had been constructed or assembled. It had the quality of something grown rather than built, though Arthur was aware that this distinction might be entirely meaningless when applied to whatever had made this. In the center of the chamber, suspended without visible support approximately 1.5 meters above the floor, was a structure. Arthur had tried in the hours since to describe this structure to people who hadn't seen it. He had never succeeded. The closest he could come was to say, "Imagine a beehive, but recursive, layers within layers, each layer a different geometry, each one counter-rotating against the others at a speed too slow to be sure you weren't imagining it. Imagine that the material it was made of was not any material you had seen before, something that absorbed light and emitted it simultaneously, something that made your eyes want to look away and look closer at the same time. Imagine that its overall shape seemed to change depending on the angle you viewed it from, not because it was actually changing, but because the geometry it expressed was one that human eyes were not fully equipped to parse. That was approximately the structure. It was not moving, then it was. The motion began as a barely perceptible shift in the counter-rotation of the innermost layer, a change in rhythm rather than speed, the way a heartbeat changes before a person wakes. Then the outer layers began to respond, each one adjusting relative to the others in a reconfiguration that took 11 minutes by Arthur's suit clock and felt like both 11 seconds and 11 years. He stood absolutely still throughout. Cassidy stood beside him, her sensor package running continuously, and neither of them spoke. He noticed, at some point during the reconfiguration, that he was not afraid. This struck him as significant. He had expected fear, had been braced for it. Instead, what he felt was a quality of attention so complete that it had displaced everything else. Every sense he possessed was aimed at the structure in front of him with the focused totality of a person who understands, at some cellular level, that what they are witnessing will not come again. The structure completed its reconfiguration and stilled. Its new form bore no resemblance to its previous form. It bore no resemblance to anything Arthur had seen anywhere, in any context, in any medium. It was not threatening. It was not welcoming. It was not beautiful in any way he had language for. It was simply, entirely, profoundly other, a shape that had been arrived at through a process of evolution and design that had occurred under conditions he could not imagine, expressing a logic he had no framework to evaluate. "Cassidy," he said, his voice was very quiet. "I see it. What are the sensors showing?" A pause. "Arthur, my radiation counter." He checked his own, background levels unchanged. He had been monitoring it since they entered. "What about it?" "When we entered, it was reading 12 microsieverts per hour. That's normal background for surface operations." Another pause, longer. "It's been dropping since the structure started moving. It's currently reading 4 microsieverts per hour." Arthur stared at his display. Background radiation didn't drop. Not without active shielding, not without an intervention. "Something in here is neutralizing ambient radiation," he said. "Something in here is neutralizing ambient radiation," Cassidy confirmed. "In response to our presence. It started the moment the structure began moving." The implication settled over them, both in the silence that followed. Whatever the structure was, whatever intelligence had built it and left it here 40 meters under the surface of Mars, it had, in some way that they could not yet understand, decided to make the environment slightly less lethal for the 2 humans who had just walked into its home. This was either the most comforting thing Arthur had ever encountered, or the most terrifying. He could not yet determine which. Then the bioluminescence changed. The irregular pulse that had lit the walls since they entered had been arrhythmic, organic feeling, the way breathing is rhythmic without being metronomic. Now it shifted. The randomness resolved slowly into pattern. A pulse, then a pause. 2 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, pause, 5, 7. "Cassidy." Arthur grabbed her arm without looking away from the walls. "I'm counting," she said. Her voice had changed. The professional flatness was still there, but under it something else had surfaced, something Arthur had never heard in her voice before, and it took him a moment to identify it. Wonder. Raw, undisguised, almost frightened wonder. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. "Arthur, that's a prime number sequence. It knows we're here. It's known since the drill broke through." She was already pulling up her waveform analysis tool, her hands moving with a controlled urgency that matched the pounding of his own blood. "It waited. It let us come in. It reconfigured, possibly to display itself in a form we could perceive, and now it's using mathematics. It's using the one language that doesn't require shared biology or shared culture or shared history." The primes continued. 11, 13, 17, 19, 23. The light pulsed along the walls in slow, deliberate sequence, and the structure at the center of the room rotated with a new kind of stillness, the stillness of something paying attention. "It's communicating," Arthur said. "It's introducing itself," Cassidy said, and then almost to herself, "or it's asking us to." The comm crackled. Both of them froze. It was the automated check-in signal from Hella's station, the hourly ping that Mission Control's software sent to all suited personnel, a brief burst of telemetry that required no response and generated a routine log entry. 6 hours had passed. The 8-hour window was closing. The structure pulsed once, a single, long luminescence that lasted exactly as long as the comm signal and ended precisely when it ended. Then it dimmed. Not to darkness, to the irregular, breathing pulse it had displayed when they first entered, but the prime sequence had stopped. The section of wall behind them, the aperture through which they had descended, remained open. They were not trapped. The bore shaft was accessible, but something in the quality of the silence had shifted, and Arthur felt it in the back of his teeth. "It noticed the signal," he said. "Yes. It knows we're not alone." "It has known since before we arrived," Cassidy said quietly. "The automated telemetry, the drilling vibrations, the electromagnetic footprint of the station, Arthur, whatever built this has been aware of Hellas Station probably since we started construction. We didn't find it. It allowed itself to be found." This realization arrived with the particular weight of something that changes the shape of every thought that comes after it. Arthur stood with it for a moment, letting it settle. "We have to report this," he said. "I know. Now." "I know," she said again. "I just wanted," she stopped. "More time," he said. "More time," she agreed. He understood. Once the report went out, this stopped being theirs. It stopped being a moment between two people and a sphere of silicon carbide under the Martian surface. It became a crisis, a protocol, an international incident. It became the largest thing that had ever happened in human history, and the two of them would become footnotes. The technician and the geophysicist who happened to be at the end of the drill when the bit broke through. He looked at the structure one last time. It rotated slowly in its suspension, luminescent and patient, and absolutely indifferent to his feelings about any of this. "We go up," he said. "We go up," she confirmed. They ascended through the bore shaft in silence, and the aperture behind them did not close. They reported everything. There was never a version of this where they didn't. Arthur had known it before they descended, and he knew it now, standing in the comms room at 5:47 hours Hellas local time, dictating into the recorder with Cassidy beside him, both of them still in their undersuit liners because neither had thought to change. Dr. Chowdhury had been woken by the anomalous telemetry flag, and now stood in the doorway in his thermal underlayer, saying nothing, his face doing the careful recalibration of a person processing information that doesn't fit any existing category. The report went out at 6:01 hours. Full sensor data, video feed from both suit cameras, Cassidy's spectrographic analysis, the radiation readings, the prime sequence recording. Everything. They waited 20 minutes for it to reach Earth. Then they waited for a response. The response, when it came, was 43 minutes long. The first 72 hours were controlled chaos. The kind of chaos that looks like order from the outside because the people involved are too professional to visibly fall apart, but which is, underneath, a cascading series of organizations realizing simultaneously that none of their existing protocols apply. NASA invoked Emergency Procedure 7, which covered anomalous contact scenarios and had last been updated in 2031, when everyone who wrote it had still privately believed it would never be needed. The procedure called for immediate communications lockdown, no outgoing transmissions except on secure channels, no incoming transmissions not routed through mission control. Hellas Station was cut off from the public internet within 90 minutes of the initial report. The UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space convened an emergency session that lasted 11 hours and produced a 40-page document recommending caution, consultation, and the establishment of a multinational oversight body that would itself require 6 months to establish. This document was noted and filed. 3 separate intelligence agencies, which Arthur and Cassidy knew about only in retrospect, immediately began arguing jurisdictional precedence over the site, a dispute that was technically moot given that Mars was not sovereign territory under any existing framework, but which consumed enormous institutional energy nonetheless. The first government response vessel departed Earth orbit less than 48 hours after the report arrived. It carried 23 personnel, 4 tons of scientific equipment, and enough communications hardware to establish an independent relay network. It would take 4 months to arrive. This felt, to the 8 people at Hellas Station, like an eternity. To the agencies coordinating the response, it felt like an impossibly short timeline. Cassidy spent those first 72 hours in the data, running the sensor recordings through every analysis tool she had, cross-referencing the prime sequence with known SETI research, building models of the structure's internal geometry from the spectrographic data. She slept 4 hours out of every 24, in her chair, and Arthur brought her coffee that she didn't notice she was drinking. Arthur spent those 72 hours doing what he always did when things were beyond his control. He maintained the equipment. He checked the bore shaft supports. He verified the atmospheric sensors. He replaced a failing capacitor in the secondary comm array. He did these things carefully and thoroughly, because in his experience, the universe rarely gave you warning before it required your machinery to be in perfect working order. On the 3rd day, the station director, Commander Yuki Tanaka, who had said almost nothing since the report went out, and who Arthur had come to understand was performing the most demanding act of leadership he had ever witnessed, which was simply not making things worse, called a full team meeting. "The sphere is still open," she said. "It hasn't closed. It hasn't changed. Mission Control wants to establish a monitoring perimeter and wait for the response team." She paused. "I want to know what the people in this room think." There was a long silence. Dr. Chowdhury spoke first. He was a small man with a large medical degree and a habit of looking at problems from angles that made other people uncomfortable. "It introduced itself," he said, "with mathematics, and then it stopped when it detected our automated signal. That suggests it understood that the signal meant more of us were coming." "It's waiting," said Petra Vasquez, their atmospheric chemist who had been very quiet for 3 days. "It waited 800,000 years once. It can wait 4 months." "We don't know it's been there 800,000 years, Cassidy said. "The regolith stratigraphy above the sphere is consistent with deposition rates of." "I know what it's consistent with," Cassidy said. "I'm saying we don't know." Another silence. Commander Tanaka looked at Arthur. "Voss, you've been down there. What do you think it wants?" Arthur thought about this for a long time. He thought about the aperture opening in response to their drilling, not as a defense mechanism but as an invitation. He thought about the radiation levels dropping. He thought about the prime sequence, offered not to the governments of Earth or the agencies of humanity, but to 2 exhausted people covered in drilling fluid who had happened to be closest. "I don't think it wants anything," he said finally. "I think it's curious, the same way we're curious. I think it's been down there for a long time and something finally came close enough to notice, and it thought." He stopped, aware of how far outside his competence this was. "I think it wanted to see what we'd do." The room was quiet for a moment. "And what did we do?" Tanaka asked. "We went in," Arthur said. 4 months and 11 days after the initial report, the first response vessel achieved Mars orbit. Within a week, the Hellas Basin had been transformed. Arc lights blazed where there had been only rig lamps and helmet torches. A perimeter of monitoring equipment ringed the bore site in concentric circles, each ring dedicated to a different agency or institutional interest. The 8 original Hellas Station crew had been joined by 23 new arrivals, then by a second vessel carrying 31 more, then by a third whose manifest listed its personnel as scientific support staff, but who moved with the posture of people trained for something other than science. Arthur watched it from the eastern ridge. He came here in the evenings when his shift was done, climbing the 200-meter basalt escarpment that edged the basin's eastern rim, finding a flat ledge where he could sit with his back to the rock and look down at the lit machinery of humanity's response to the most significant event in its history. From up here in the dark, with the Martian stars overhead in a density impossible on Earth, the whole apparatus looked small, purposeful and small. Cassidy climbed up beside him on the 43rd day after the response team's arrival. She moved carefully on the loose basalt, her suit patched at the left elbow where she'd caught it on a monitoring bracket 3 weeks earlier. She sat beside him without preamble and looked down at the lights. "They tried the prime sequence today," she said. "Broadcast it through the radio array. Full sequence from 2 to 97. "I heard," he said. "What happened?" "Nothing. The sphere didn't respond." He nodded. He had expected this. "They're going to try sound waves next," Cassidy said. "Vibrational patterns through the bore shaft walls, then light patterns through fiber optic cable, then—" She stopped. "They have 47 protocols. I've read them all." "What do you think will happen?" "I think—" She was quiet for a moment. Below them, a transport crawler moved between the monitoring rings, its lights small and methodical. "I think when we went down there it was 2 people, without a plan, without a protocol. We didn't know what we were doing, and it knew we didn't know, and somehow that was—" She searched for the word. "Honest," Arthur offered. "Yes, honest." She turned to look at him. "Now there are committees and protocols and jurisdictional frameworks, and I think it can tell the difference." Arthur thought about the aperture opening in response to their drill bit, the radiation dropping. The prime sequence offered quietly in the dark to 2 people who had come not because they were authorized to, but because they were there. He thought about the long pause after the automated comm signal, the structure dimming, the sense, impossible to quantify, impossible to report to any committee, of something that had been reaching toward them, withdrawing just slightly. "Do you think it'll answer them?" he asked. "Eventually." Cassidy was quiet for a long time. Below, the basin blazed with the full power of human institutional response. 54 people and thousands of tons of equipment trained on a 12-meter sphere of silicon carbide that had been waiting patiently in the Martian ground since before the first modern humans had left Africa. "I think it'll decide," she said at last, "what it wants to be to us, what we get to be to it." She paused. "I think it's already deciding. Based on what it's seen of us. Based on what it's seen of us." Arthur looked up. The Milky Way arched overhead, visible here in a way it hadn't been from Earth since before the age of electric light, dense and specific and humbling. Somewhere up there, or somewhere he couldn't point to, or somewhere in a direction for which no human geometry had a name, was wherever the makers of the sphere had come from, or gone to, or were. He didn't find this comforting. He didn't find it terrifying. He found it, in a way he had no prior framework for, simply true. On the 51st day after the response team's arrival, the sphere did something new. At 3:12 hours local time, while most of the expanded team slept and the monitoring equipment ran its automated cycles, every sensor in every ring registered a simultaneous event. The sphere's wall luminescence peaked to a brightness that overloaded 3 separate optical detectors, held for exactly 11 seconds, and then returned to its normal pulsing rhythm. 11 seconds. A prime number. The event was logged, analyzed, debated in 6 time zones, and formally classified as Category 2 Possible Intentional Signal by the Oversight Committee's 3rd subpanel. 47 response protocols were reviewed. A consensus could not be reached on which, if any, to deploy. Arthur was awake when it happened. He was sitting in the common room, drinking coffee that had been brewed 6 hours earlier and had gone completely cold, reading a message from his sister in Calgary that had taken 22 minutes to arrive and would take 22 minutes to answer. He read the brightness report on his tablet. He sat with it for a while. Then he wrote back to his sister, "I'm fine. Mars is fine. Something happened here that I'm not allowed to describe yet, but that you'll hear about eventually. Tell Mom I'm okay. Tell her the stars here are incredible." He sent it. Then he sat in the common room with his cold coffee and the photograph of the Pacific Ocean on the wall, and thought about what it meant that something 40 meters below him had, on its own schedule and by its own logic, decided that 51 days was long enough to wait before saying hello again. He didn't have an answer. He thought, for the first time since this began, that not having an answer might be exactly the right place to start. Excerpt from the personal journal of Dr. Cassidy Reyes, Hella Station, Mars. The sphere has now communicated 14 times, always at night by our local clock. Always in prime number sequences, though the sequences have grown more complex. Last week it ran a pattern that Dr. Akafer from the University of Lagos spent 4 days analyzing before concluding that it was encoding something that might be spatial coordinates, though coordinates in a reference frame we don't yet understand. The protocols have not worked. I say this without satisfaction. The people running the protocols are serious, intelligent professionals doing exactly what serious, intelligent professionals do, which is to apply structured methodology to an unstructured problem. The sphere simply doesn't respond to transmitted signals. Radio, light, vibration, nothing. It responds only to physical presence in the shaft, and mission control has restricted access to essential monitoring personnel only. I am no longer essential monitoring personnel. I have been reclassified as original contact witness and assigned a role on the documentation subcommittee. I attend meetings. I write reports that synthesize other people's reports. I am, in the institutional architecture that has grown up around this discovery, a historical artifact. Arthur was transferred to the secondary equipment team 3 months ago. He maintains the monitoring array. He climbs the eastern ridge in the evenings. I join him when I can. We don't talk much up there anymore. There isn't much left to say that can be said in words. Something happened to both of us in that sphere, something that the debriefs and the psychological evaluations and the formal testimony couldn't quite reach. We went somewhere that no one else has been, and we came back. And the world we came back to is the same world we left but arranged differently. The way a room looks different once you've understood what all the furniture is for. Last night from the ridge, we watched the 8th brightness event. 13 seconds this time. The monitoring equipment logged it and the analysts processed it and the committee convened and the protocols were reviewed. Arthur said, very quietly, that he thought it was trying a different approach. I asked him what he meant. He said, when something keeps saying hello and no one answers the way it expects, eventually it tries a different kind of hello. I've been thinking about that ever since. The sphere has been here for 800,000 years. We have been on Mars for less than 3. Whatever patience it has is built on a timescale that makes our entire civilization look like an afternoon. It is not in any hurry. I think about the moment we descended, the two of us, unprepared, unauthorized, guided by nothing more sophisticated than the belief that going forward was more honest than going back. I think about the radiation dropping. I think about the primes offered in the dark, to us and not to anyone else. I think about what Arthur said in the team meeting 4 months ago now. It wanted to see what we'd do. We went in. I wonder sometimes in the evenings on the ridge with the Martian stars overhead, whether going in was the right answer or just an answer. Whether the sphere is still processing what it learned about us in those 4 hours, running its own analysis, building its own models. Whether what it concludes will be based on the 2 exhausted people who climbed down a bore shaft in the dark with their hearts pounding and their radiation counters climbing, or on the 94 people and the protocols and the committees that came after. I wonder which version of us it's deciding about. I wonder if it's decided already. And